Nerd Central Podcast, or NCP. My name is Stazz, and today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about cosplay! Yay, cosplay! With Halloween fastly approaching, it's another reason for us cosplayers to dress up in our awesomeness and in our armor and whatnot, and show it around to our non-cosplay friends and have them wonder about our mental health. No, I'm kidding. The topic of this episode is going to be materials. And at least when I started cosplaying, or at least starting to at least look into it, one thing I didn't come across, or one thing I wish I came across was what materials you can use. Because I assumed, and I started off sculpting and molding the sculptures. Now, how I started back in high school, and this is about 7 years ago, and I was rougher than, a piece of sandpaper. Like, it was really bad. My first ever cosplay was a homemade Predator costume, which for the time I was very proud of, but excuse me, looking back at it now, I wish I did it a whole nother way. And part of that reason is the materials I have now come across. So with that in mind, I'm just going to kind of just list a couple of materials that you can use, and from there, what's the best ways I've used them, and from that, I don't expect this to be, an hour-long intro to how to use foam or how to use Bondo. It's just going to be kind of a quick little thing and something that's on my mind that I just kind of wanted to record and kind of just throw it out there for the world to listen, if the world decides to listen to it. So my first, like I mentioned before, my first experience for making costumes or cosplaying was sculpting. Now, there are two, more or less, forms of clay that you can use. You have oil-based clay, and then you have water-based clay. I prefer the water-based clay, not because it dries, because I don't let any of my clay sculptures dry, at least when I use water-based clay. What I do is I find that I can get different grades of consistency with a single clay. So, for example, let's say I'm sculpting a head, and I need my clay to be firmly, to have a nice firm touch. What I can do is I can actually leave the bag open, let it air out a little bit, let some of the moisture evaporate out of the clay, and then I can take that, and then that'll be a much harder, leathery style clay where I can get, maybe finer detail into, like, I don't know, like an eyebrow or something like that. Or if I'm making, like, really like a grizzly character with, monster teeth, I don't want the clay to, not hold itself up if it's super soft, and like these, gigantic spikes are falling or drooping. So what I can do is I can leave this, water-based clay out. It'll dry up a little bit. It'll still be you can still sculpt in it, and if you want to, you can still, if you want it to go back to something soft, you can just throw it, put it in some water, or take it, put it back in the bag. What I do is I spritz water in the bag with a spritz bottle, and then I just kind of wrap the bag up and I let it soak for about 10-15 minutes, and that'll give it to that really nice, smooth, creamy consistency like it originally has. Now, your other option is oil-based clay. Now, I've sculpted in some oil-based clay. What the big advantage to oil-based clay is that it never will dry out. And, well, it'll dry out if you keep using it with molds and sculptures, meaning that whenever you make a mold of a head, the molding compound will slowly suck out the oil out of it, and it'll basically just be like a big old, like, brittle, or not necessarily brittle, but it won't hold together anymore. But that's something completely different. But you can take your oil-based clay and you can kind of just sculpt however you want. Now, with that in mind, you have to kind of pick and stick with a consistency. Now, I know some people will mix and match. They'll use a harder clay for armor, and then they'll use a medium or a softer clay to get finer detail in for like a face or something like that. That's totally up to you. I prefer the medium hardness or medium firm oil clay, just because from there I can still get a armor-like appearance, or I can still sculpt in texture detail for a face. And sometimes with oil-based clay, you can actually heat it up with a heat gun a little bit and kind of make the outer layer soft, and then that'll be just thick enough to where you can actually add in finer, like hair detail or wrinkles for that matter. You can't do that with all oil-based clay because sometimes the oil-based clay will have sulfur mixed in with it, and that's something that's like a no-no, especially if you accidentally start to burn it. But you can find, for example, there's like something called Monster Maker clay, which you can get off of monstermaker.com, which is actually a really good website to go, get a lot of the stuff at. But you can actually, that's a clay, that's an oil-based clay, but you can actually heat it down to a liquid and use it for casting, and you can make a arm clay cast, and you can sculpt either, you can remove fingers from there, and then you can make, finger disembodiments and stuff like that, for Halloween, whatever you can do. That it's a really cool material if you can get the right stuff to melt down oil-based clay with. Now, like I mentioned before, I prefer water-based clay because that's what I was introduced to. And another thing, too, is that water-based clay is actually really cheap. You can, for example, on Amazon, you can get a fairly decent grade of clay for 25 to 30 bucks for 50 pounds. That's a lot of clay, especially if you're making small little tidbits or making, for example, I'll be sculpting a Joker mask off the new 52. That 50 pounds of clay is going to be more than enough. I can make like 4 or 5, and that's with me like being generous on the clay. Like there's enough. While oil-based clay is going to be more expensive, and with oil-based clay, that's something that the mentality that you're going to invest in. So you can invest in 15 pounds of clay, but that might be like 60 to 75 bucks, but you're going to be reusing that. So while my cheap water-based clay is 25 to 30, after a while I'm going to have to buy it again, And if I'm sculpting, for example, 3 figures, I'm going to have to maybe double down or maybe, buy 3 50-pound bags of clay. And all of a sudden, I'm already out, some money if I just stuck with an oil-based clay. But, that's just something that's personal preference, something that you might want to, experiment with, especially if you've never sculpted before. Pick up some, what you can even do, too, is pick up some, Play-Doh or cheap modeling clay off of, like, Joann's or Michael's, and just sculpt with it. Just figure out what you think you can't or can't do, and just sculpt with it. That's the greatest thing that at least clay offers, is you totally have is a free range of doing whatever you want. As long as you can think it, you can technically do it. So from there, my first experience was clay. From there, I would then model or mold whatever I'm sculpting, and then cast it. Now, my modeling materials was mostly just plaster of Paris, and from there I would make they're called like one-time overs or breakaway molds. Basically, when I sculpted my Predator helmet, I sculpted out of clay, and then I put a fairly medium to a thick coat of plaster of Paris or plaster over the whole sculpture, so it'll hold its, it won't necessarily break apart when I pick it up, but from there it'll have a good negative. It'll actually hold a fairly decent negative, especially if it's for like a Predator mask. You don't need a lot of detail. So then I would then put resin on the negative side, and I'll have a positive. So my resin that I actually first experienced with was like your typical like car resin. And for something like that, that's the stuff that you can get like the Bondo and the Bondo brand resin, or the 3M resins. Those are actually going to work pretty good. I haven't really done any experimentation with like the Smooth On or the other types of resin, like different grades of it, because one's more usable for like slush casting or whatever the case may be. I, at the time, was just using something I could buy at a store when I needed it, or if I needed to buy more of it, I can do so. And this is on a very limited budget as well. So from there on, after I did that, I would put the resin in the plaster mold. Once it sets up, break the plaster so I don't have that mold again. And I would then have a fiberglass helmet. So, and I did that for a lot of my stuff, actually, to be honest. I made a couple of gauntlets that way, and it worked, but I felt like I was wasting more material than I needed to use, and I felt like if I needed to fix something, or if I needed to, like, fine or detail, this fiberglass and sculpting method didn't give me the detail I wanted. Now, after that, I discovered that people could use hot glue. Now, with hot glue, what's the benefit of that is it's fairly cheap, and you can kind of paint it in layers or use it in layers, and it'll hold its shape, and it'll be fairly lightweight. So my best example of that is for my second C2E2. I'm from the Chicagoland area. Myself and a bunch of our friends, we dressed up for Walking Dead, and I had to make a prop out of the hot glue. And I chose hot glue because it was a material that I wanted to try, and I saw some really kick-ass costumes from it. For example, the Guyver costume from Bioweapons. I know he's still around. I think he did like the die deck from Halo 4, which is really, really cool. Go check out his stuff. I think it's like, you can Google, Bioweapons and see what pops up. But so essentially, it's almost the exact same way of making this prop. I sculpted it out of clay, and at this time I was using oil-based clay. Thought it was pretty decent. I liked it. And then from there, I made a whatchamacallit. I used silicone caulking material, which if you guys, excuse me for the sound here. So I used silicone caulking material, and from there, that actually gave me a good flexible mold. Now you can you use silicone caulking, but silicone mold making material, but that can actually get fairly expensive. And again, I was doing everything on the cheap or very, very limited budget, so it actually worked out pretty decent. And then I made a plaster mother mold, and then poured the hot glue in there, and that actually came out a pretty decent piece of armor. If I had to do it again, I would probably, and this is what I've done in the now recently, is use a actual heat heat plate or a hot plate, and then use it like a wok, because the wok will distribute the heat much more evenly than like a pan or anything like that. And basically like slush cast the hot glue. The only bad part about doing that is that if you use a fairly decent chunk of hot glue, like almost, I don't know, like a water bottle's worth of hot glue, that's actually quite a lot. The problem that you come across is the hot glue will, if you're not distributing it far enough in the mold, the hot glue will settle in some areas, so you'll have big pools of extra material that you don't need. If you're making it, a piece of, like a gauntlet or like forearm armor, you don't need this pool of glue that you can't all of a sudden fit your arm in. While the hot glue would be probably a good material used to make like flat surfaces or semicircular surfaces. You would need to, if you're going to make like a mask out of it or a helmet, you would need to use, I think, thinner, or well, at least what I figured out, thinner coats of it, and chill it right away. So if you have an access to like a fridge or something like that, that'll help out tremendously. So from there, I then started to use foam. Now, I did use foam for my Predator costume, and that was something that I had very limited workings with. I just basically made a flat surface, and then used another piece of foam to make a raised, edge, and then just do stuff over like that over and over again. I didn't really make anything cylindrical or try and shape it up until I made Apocalypse for this recent Wizard World. And you can see those pictures on our Nerd Central Facebook, and I thought it actually came out pretty decent. I'm gonna add to it, but the foam itself is a EVA foam, which is a closed cell foam, or most of it claims to be closed cell foam. And with that is you can heat it up, and once you heat it up, you can then form it into an object or a shape, and it'll hold its shape almost to what you formed it to. So, for example, people will use it, at least women cosplayers will use it to make breast armor because it will hold to their breast shape much more easier or better than having to sculpt something out or using Wonderflex or Warbla, which is another casting material that you can heat up and bend to a shape. With foam, you can do that as well, but it's a little bit more rigid and it'll hold its shape much more easier than having to do anything like that. So with foam, my biggest tip is if you do decide to use foam, don't be afraid to buy it online. And the reason why I say that is you can get much bigger pieces of foam for a much cheaper price than going to your Michael's or your Joann's, or hell, even your Home Depot or Walmart, because they'll carry foam sheets as well. And from there, you also want another tip is is you want to keep different variations of thickness. So usually what I like to use is I like to use roughly like a 2mm, which is about a quarter of an inch thick foam, and then I have something that's almost about half an inch thick. And with those two materials, I can create enough depth, or I can create a structure that it will look like a pretty solid piece of chest armor or shoulder armor or pauldrons or something like that. It'll give it that nice 3D look to it. If I had everything all at the same thickness at that point, it might not look right, and especially if you start using it around gauntlets or making forearm armor, you can start coming across to where it won't hold its shape well, or it'll bulge out, and all of a sudden you got this it looks like really big armor on a tiny person, and that might not have the look that you're looking for. And then again, if you want to do that, go for it. Who am I to say? And then another thing too is that with foam, while you might not think it to be sandable or using, for example, a Dremel tool, foam is actually a fairly good material to sand. And if you have a Dremel and a sanding drum on the Dremel, you can actually sand it down and make some nice curved edges, or at least attempt to. The thing with foam, though, is that once you heat it up and make it into a shape, it'll bounce back a little bit, so it won't hold that shape that well. What a lot of people do is that they'll cut into the underside and then glue in the underside to each other, and then they'll hold a much more rigid shape, and then they'll sand down that more. Whatever the case may be, you can do whatever you need to do. But you can sand foam. That's basically what I'm trying to come across, and that comes out pretty decent. As long as you're not using a really rough grit paper or a sanding drum, and use maybe like a fine sand. Maybe like in the upper hundreds or thousands, because you don't really need to take off, at least in my experience. I'm not taking off layers, inches on inches. I'm just more or less trying to round out an edge or something like that. Now no, the thing that I haven't had the ability to use yet is I've been thinking about using plastics. And the most common plastics are Wonderflex and or Warbla, which Wonderflex is I believe it's a plastic thermo sheet of plastic, almost similar to like Sintra, which is another mold making or model making material, but it's interjected with cross stream, so it'll hold a shape really well. While Warbla, I keep calling it Warbla. Warbla is more or less a plastic interjected with wood particles. So you can heat it up, at least with Warbla, heat it up, and you can actually not sculpt, but you can take up scraps and mold it back together like putty, and then use it that way. I would like to use those materials next in my cosplaying career. I haven't really had the perfect project to use it for, but that is another material that you can use as well. And I've seen beautiful pieces of armor, helmets, swords, and anything really. Now, to keep in mind is that nothing that I said is right or wrong. You can do whatever you want. You can use whatever material you want, and don't be afraid of doing trial and error. I can tell you right now that, for example, If I knew now what when I made my Apocalypse armor back, give it back to my high school self and how to make a Predator suit again, it would look so much better. However, that journey of trial and error and getting to where I am now, I think is much, 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 much more valuable than being able to do it, just like that, at the snap of a finger. So, and another thing too is I mentioned painting. I'm sorry, I didn't mention painting. But I want to mention painting. Is you can get really good effects with rattle cans. Just make sure that you get stuff that bonds to plastic. And the reason why you want it to bond to plastic is most of the time you're going to find yourself using foam pieces, or at least I am, and you need something that'll bond really good to it. What you can use is you can coat your foam pieces with wood glue or gesso, which is pretty much like a thick water-based coating that after so many coats, your paint will stick to it really well. What I do is I actually use liquid latex, and I put it in thin coats until I feel like it has a skin to it. Now, what this does is that it gives a much more organic look to it. And the people that I'm cosplaying as, I can get away with that look and that feel. If I was doing, like, for example, like a metal suit or like a Halo armor, if I decided to make it out of foam, I might want to use a EVA a wood glue or that gesso glue, and give it that that metallic look to it. So, and also too, is you don't necessarily need to airbrush anything. I recently did airbrushing, and it is fun to do, and it gave me some really cool effects. But if you don't have it, or if you're pinched on time or on money, you can get really beautiful effects if when you use a sponge or a paintbrush or even a rattle can. You just got to be careful on your approach to it. You don't want to overdo it. Or if you don't want to, don't make it too cartoony as well. You want to kind of keep some realism to everything. So that's actually going to probably conclude this episode of NCP. And I hope this was informative for anybody who was listening. And again, I wanted to do something that will kind of be like some little tidbits or little tips that I've at least come across in my cosplaying career. And hopefully, you find this helpful. And hopefully this will give you some motivation to maybe finish your costume or your piece of armor or mask for Halloween or by Halloween. So, and hopefully you guys will hear from us again and talk to you soon. Bye.